She believed the worst punishment a mother could receive was watching her children suffer, without being able to do anything about it. For years, Moira had walked the narrow streets of Galway carrying 3 small miracles and 3 open wounds. Everyone said it was God's fault, blood's fault, fate's fault, but she knew the truth was far darker. Only no one, not even the husband who slept beside her every night, could know what really happened. But destiny has a cruel way of tearing secrets from us, and when a man who had humiliated her knelt before her, begging forgiveness, Moira understood that the past she'd tried to bury would return, with names, faces, and tears that could never be forgotten. There are stories that break the heart, and there are stories that turn it inside out. This is one of them. The morning in Salt Hill dawned with a dense fog, the kind that swallows the sea and makes the sound of church bells seem distant, almost mournful. Moira Ní Chonaill sat on the edge of the bed, watching little Cian sleep. His arm, atrophied and delicate, rested on the pillow with a peace she knew to be unfair. With each breath her son took, her chest sank in a mixture of love and guilt so profound it felt like drowning on dry land. On the floor between her worn slippers lay a cardboard box she hadn't opened since the birth, but that day the wind knocked it over. When the contents spilled out, Moira saw a yellowed document bearing the emblem of University Hospital Galway, and a signature, Dr. Callum Byrne, Project Ariu. The blue ink, smudged and faded, seemed somehow still alive, still breathing accusation. For several seconds, she thought her heart had stopped. The name of that doctor had never been spoken in this house since her first pregnancy, and yet there it was, like a ghost stamped on official paper. In the footer, an almost illegible note, dose administered according to experimental protocol 4B. Moira held the paper as one holds a serpent. Her husband, Patrick O'Hanlon, still slept in the next room, exhausted from the previous night's fishing, and she knew, in that very instant, that she could never tell him what she had discovered. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like wet stone, cold and immovable. The fog from the sea covered the horizon, but Moira felt it wasn't just the sky that was disappearing. Something inside her began to die, what remained of faith, of innocence, of rest. And the sound of an old voice from the nurse who had attended her during childbirth echoed in her memory with devastating clarity. Moira, sometimes the body knows things the doctor shouldn't have been told to do. She understood too late what that meant, and for the first time she knew with certainty why her children were born the way they were born. Her hands trembled as she gathered the papers, shoving them back into the box with a violence born of desperation. The document crinkled under her fingers, and she thought about burning it, burying it, throwing it into the Atlantic where secrets go to drown. But she couldn't, because without it, she had no proof. Without it, she was just another grieving mother making accusations against a respected man in a white coat. The system protected men like Byrne. The system always had. Cian stirred in his sleep, making a small sound that pierced her heart. She moved to him instinctively, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. His face was angelic, untouched by the knowledge of what had been done to him before he even drew his first breath. In the next room, she could hear Ian moving about, his uneven gait distinctive even through the walls. The foot twisted from birth, another gift from Dr. Byrne's experimental protocol. And somewhere in the house, her eldest, Oisin, would be waking soon, his developmental delays making every morning a patient negotiation with a world that moved too fast for him. 3 children, 3 damaged bodies, 1 medical experiment. The rage that rose in Moira's throat tasted like copper and salt, like blood and seawater mixed. She had trusted them. When Dr. Byrne had offered her the vitamin supplements during her pregnancies, saying they would ensure healthy babies, she had taken them gratefully. She was poor, uneducated in medical matters, desperate to give her children every advantage. How could she have known? How could any of them have known? The sound of Patrick's footsteps in the hall made her quickly wipe her eyes. She couldn't let him see her like this. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. He entered the room with that gentle smile he always wore when he looked at their sleeping son, completely unaware that the floor beneath their life had just cracked open. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" he said softly, kissing the top of her head. His hands smelled of fish and salt and honest work. "Fog's clearing. Thought I might take the boat out again this afternoon." Moira nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched him cross to Cian's bed, watched him gently touch their son's good hand with such tenderness it made her want to scream. Patrick loved these boys with every fiber of his being. He prayed for them, worked himself to exhaustion for them, dreamed impossible dreams of their futures. And he believed, truly believed, that their conditions were simply God's mysterious will. But Moira now knew different, and that knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and getting heavier by the moment. She thought of all those other women who might have sat in Dr. Burns' office, who might have taken those same pills, who might have given birth to children marked by Experimental Protocol 4B. How many were there? How many mothers were out there right now looking at their damaged children and believing it was their fault, their genes, their sin? The injustice of it made her feel physically sick. But alongside the nausea came something else, a burning, righteous fury that felt almost like strength. She had been silent for 7 years. She had carried the grief and the guilt and the exhaustion without complaint, believing she had no right to question men of medicine and education. But now she had proof. Now she had a name. Now she had a choice. The question was, what would she do with it? Speaking out meant destroying everything. Her husband's faith, their fragile peace, possibly their entire life here in Salt Hill. The church and the medical establishment would close ranks. They would call her mad, hysterical, vengeful. They would say she was a grieving mother, looking for someone to blame. And Patrick would have to know that she'd kept this secret, that she'd suspected something was wrong and said nothing for all these years. But staying silent meant letting Dr. Byrne continue, meant letting him smile in his white coat and shake hands with politicians, and perhaps, God help them all, perhaps do it again to other desperate women in other examination rooms. Outside, the fog was lifting, revealing the gray-green sea beneath. Moira stood and walked to the window, the document hidden now in her apron pocket, burning against her hip like a brand. Somewhere out there, in one of those grand houses in Galway or perhaps in Dublin, Dr. Callum Byrne was waking up to another day, free and prosperous and utterly untouched by the devastation he had caused. Not for much longer, Moira thought. The thought surprised her with its fierceness, its certainty. She didn't know yet what she would do, or how she would do it. But she knew with a clarity that felt almost holy, that silence was no longer an option. The truth demanded to be spoken, no matter the cost, and she would be the one to speak it, even if it destroyed her in the process. In the days that followed, Moira walked through the village like someone carrying stones in her soul. The box remained locked at the back of the wardrobe, and the document folded inside an old missal, between the prayers of St. Columba. At the parish cafe where the women commented on the weather and the tides, she barely heard them. The guilt took the taste from her tea and the sound from their laughter. Patrick, oblivious, spoke about expanding the small fishing boat, dreaming of buying a piece of land in Connemara to raise the boys away from the city. He spoke of hope, and she heard sentencing. The tension emerged in every detail, in the gaze of her second son Ian, who had the clubfoot and walked with a limp that broke her heart anew each morning, in the letters from the hospital with cold words like genetic anomaly, which now seemed to mock her with their clinical lies. Moira knew there was nothing genetic about it. There was human guilt hidden beneath a medical seal, buried under the weight of institutional respectability and men in positions of power who believed themselves untouchable. On silent nights, she would rise from bed and read the paper under the lamplight as one prays a punishment. The word experimental was beginning to lose meaning, until she herself felt like an experiment, a woman used and discarded, her body turned into a laboratory without her knowledge or consent. She thought of the other women from the clinic, faces she'd seen in waiting rooms swollen with pregnancy and hope. Were their children damaged too? Were they sitting in kitchens across Galway blaming themselves for outcomes that had been engineered in Dr. Byrne's examining room? The rage would come in waves, usually in those dark hours before dawn when the house was quiet and there was nothing to distract her from the truth. She would stand at the kitchen window, looking out at the empty street, and imagine confronting him. In these fantasies she was eloquent and fierce, her words cutting him down where he stood. But then morning would come, and with it the reality of her situation. She was a fisherman's wife with 3 disabled children and no education beyond primary school. Who would believe her against a doctor, a man of science and reputation? The true blow came on a Sunday afternoon, when Patrick returned from Connemara with the shine of a dream in his face. "I found a farm, Moira. It's small, but it's our chance." His hope was too pure to die there, and so she lied. She smiled, embraced him, and said, "Yes, Patrick. Let's start over. But in saying this, she knew that every step from that moment forward would be a betrayal. Because how could they start over when she was carrying this secret, this terrible knowledge that would poison any new beginning? That evening, as Patrick sat by the fire sketching plans for the farm on the back of an old envelope, Moira watched him with an ache that went deeper than bone. He was drawing a future for their family, a small cottage, a vegetable garden, a paddock for sheep. In his drawing, the boys were stick figures, all the same size, all standing straight. In his mind, they were whole and healthy and full of possibility. He couldn't see what she saw, that the damage had already been done, that no change of scenery could undo what Dr. Byrne had stolen from them. "It'll be good for the lads," Patrick said, not looking up from his sketch. His voice was warm with anticipation. "Fresh air, space to run. And Connemara. Sure, it's God's own country, isn't it? They'll thrive there, you'll see." Moira made a non-committal sound, not trusting herself to speak. How could she tell him that the problem wasn't where they lived, but what had been done to their children before they were even born? How could she explain that she'd been carrying proof of medical experimentation in her apron pocket for days, that she'd been reading and rereading it until she could recite every damning word? The worst part was the guilt that gnawed at her constantly. She had taken those pills. She had swallowed them obediently, trustingly, believing she was helping her babies. The logical part of her mind knew she was a victim, that she couldn't have known, that the fault lay entirely with Dr. Byrne and whatever twisted research he was conducting. But the mother in her, the part that had carried these children and birthed them and watched them struggle, that part whispered that she should have known better, should have questioned more, should have protected them. She thought about her own mother, dead these 10 years, who had been a traveler before settling in Salt Hill. Her mom had been wise in the old ways, suspicious of doctors and their modern medicines. "Trust your body, girl," she used to say. "Trust your instincts. These men in their white coats, they think they know better than thousands of years of women's wisdom." Moira had dismissed it as superstition, had been almost embarrassed by her mother's distrust of institutions. Now she wondered if her mam had known something, had sensed the danger that lurked behind professional smiles and reassuring words. The memory of her mother brought another surge of grief, this one mixed with longing. If her mam were alive, she would know what to do. She would have a plan, or at least the courage to act. But Moira was alone with this knowledge, isolated by her secret, watching her husband dream impossible dreams while reality sat like lead in her stomach. Days passed in this fog of tension. Moira went through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, caring for the boys, but everything felt distant, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. At Mass on Sunday, she couldn't concentrate on the prayers. The priest spoke of forgiveness and mercy, but all she could think about was justice. Did God expect her to forgive Dr. Byrne? To turn the other cheek while he continued his career, perhaps continuing his experiments on other unsuspecting women? After Mass, as they stood in the churchyard, old Mrs. Flynn approached with her usual nosiness disguised as concern. "How are the boys managing, Moira, love? I saw young Oisin the other day, and he seemed, well, bless him." The pity in the woman's voice made Moira want to scream. Everyone in the village pitied them, prayed for them, spoke in hushed tones about the O'Hanlon tragedy. They thought it was bad luck or God's will or some curse on the family line. None of them knew the truth. "They're grand, Mrs. Flynn," Moira said tightly, gathering her boys close. "Just grand." But they weren't grand. Cian had started asking questions, wondering why his arm didn't work like other children's arms. Ian had been refused entry to the national school because of his mobility issues, and Oisin, sweet Oisin, was falling further behind his peers every day, unable to grasp concepts that came easily to other children his age. The documentation in Moira's missile said, Experimental Protocol 4B, but what it really meant was 3 childhoods stolen, 3 futures limited, 3 souls carrying burdens they should never have had to bear. That night, as she tucked Cian into bed, he asked her the question she had been dreading. "Ma'am, why did God make me different?" His green eyes, so like her own, looked up at her with such trust, such faith, that she would have an answer that made sense. Moira's throat closed. She stroked his hair, searching for words that wouldn't be lies but wouldn't burden him with truth he was too young to carry. "God made you perfect, love," she whispered finally. "Perfect and special and exactly as you should be. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to know you. As Cian drifted to sleep, Moira sat beside his bed in the darkness, listening to his breathing. The document and the missile seemed to pulse with presence, demanding action, refusing to be ignored. She thought about Patrick's farm dream, about starting over, about running away from this truth to somewhere it couldn't follow them. But she knew it would follow. The secret would come with them to Connemara or anywhere else they tried to hide. It would sit between her and Patrick in every moment, poisoning every joy, tainting every hope. No, Moira realized with a clarity that was almost painful. There was no running from this. There was only through it. And that meant eventually she would have to decide, silence or truth, safety or justice, the life she had or the reckoning that was coming. The weight of that choice pressed down on her as she sat in the dark beside her sleeping son, and she wondered how much longer she could carry it before something inside her finally broke. The journey to Connemara was long and damp, and the hills seemed to watch them in silence. Rain had threatened all morning but held off, leaving the sky heavy and gray, pressing down on the landscape like a weight. Patrick drove their old van with the kind of careful optimism that broke Moira's heart. He'd polished it the night before, as if the vehicle's shine might somehow influence their fortunes. In the back, the boys sat quietly, Cian pressed against the window watching the countryside roll past, Ian fidgeting with the hem of his jumper, Oisin humming tunelessly to himself. When they arrived at the property, the man who received them, Seamus Byrne, was the portrait of everything Moira feared most: arrogance dressed in respectability, a brown tweed jacket that probably cost more than Patrick earned in a month, hands too clean for a man who claimed to work the land, and a gaze that measured people like livestock at market. He stood in the doorway of a substantial farmhouse, stone-built and solid, the kind of dwelling that spoke of generations of ownership and the security that came with never having to wonder where the next meal would come from. Patrick, full of hope, stepped forward with his hand extended. "Mr. Byrne, sir. Patrick O'Hanlon. We spoke on the telephone about the acreage you're selling." His voice carried that particular Irish deference, the ingrained respect for property owners and educated men that Moira had always found both touching and infuriating. He was a good man, her Patrick, but he'd been taught too well to know his place. Seamus Byrne shook Patrick's hand with the barest minimum of courtesy, his eyes already moving past him to survey the van, the children emerging awkwardly from the back, and finally, Moira herself. She stood slightly apart, feeling the cold air cut through her wool coat like a blade. Something in the man's expression made her skin prickle with warning. She'd seen that look before. Not often, but enough times to recognize it. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision, and was simply going through the motions of civility before delivering his verdict. Patrick, oblivious, launched into his carefully rehearsed speech about their plans. He spoke about potatoes and sheep, about giving the boys room to grow, about the healing properties of country air. His enthusiasm was genuine and painful to witness. He gestured at the field stretching out behind the farmhouse, already seeing them planted and productive in his mind's eye. Moira remained silent, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling the weight of the secret in her chest, and now this new dread settling over everything like the mist that clung to the distant mountains. The moment of tension came when Seamus Byrne's gaze finally settled on her properly, really looking at her for the first time. His eyes narrowed slightly and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the activation of some memory. When he spoke, his tone was polite, but edged with something that made Patrick's enthusiastic chatter die in his throat. "You're Moira ní Chonaill, aren't you? Or you were before you married." It wasn't really a question. "You're the daughter of Catriona ní Chonaill, that woman who traveled with the travelers before she settled in Salt Hill." Moira felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She hesitated, just for a second, just a breath, but that hesitation was enough. That tiny pause told Seamus Byrne everything he needed to know. His mouth curved into something that might have been a smile, but looked more like contempt. "I thought I recognized the name," he continued, and now the politeness was completely gone from his voice, replaced by something cold and final. "I'm sorry, Mr. O'Hanlon, but I don't sell my land to that sort." No offense meant, of course, but a man has to think about his reputation. The neighbors, you understand, family legacy and all that. The silence that followed was worse than any shout could have been. It stretched out like a chasm opening in the earth, swallowing everything. Patrick's dreams, the boys' futures, Moira's last shred of dignity. She watched Patrick's face go pale, watched his mouth open and close without sound, watched him struggle to process what had just been said. He looked like a man who'd been struck and couldn't quite understand why. Moira's hands curled into fists at her sides. The rage that rose in her was different from the anger she'd been carrying these past days. This was older, deeper, connected to every slight her mother had endured, every door that had been closed in their faces, every whispered comment about tinker blood and that sort of people. Her mother had warned her this would never go away, that it didn't matter how she dressed or spoke or tried to fit in. To men like Seamus Byrne, she would always be other, always be less. But she couldn't scream. She couldn't rage, because Ian was standing right there, his twisted foot turning inward as it always did when he was nervous, and Oisin was making that sound he made when he sensed tension, and Cian was watching with those two knowing eyes. So instead, Moira reached out and took Ewan's hand, pulling him close to her side. "Come on, Patrick," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, hard as stone and just as cold. "The sea never humiliated us. People do that, and we don't beg for scraps from people who think they're better than us because of where our mothers came from." She turned and walked back to the van, her spine straight, her head high, refusing to let Seamus Byrne see how his words had landed. She helped the boys into the back seat, her hands gentle even as her heart hammered with fury and shame. Patrick followed slowly, still stunned, still trying to make sense of how the morning's hope had turned to this. As Patrick started the engine, Moira glanced back at the farmhouse. Seamus Byrne was still standing in the doorway, watching them leave with an expression of satisfied righteousness, as if he'd just done something virtuous by refusing to lower himself. The sight of him standing there, so certain of his superiority, so comfortable in his bigotry, made something crystallize in Moira's mind. The world was full of men like him, men who believed their position gave them the right to judge and diminish others, men who hid their cruelty behind words like standards and reputation. Dr. Byrne was one of them, hiding his crimes behind medical authority and professional respect. Seamus Byrne was another, hiding his hatred behind property ownership and family legacy. They were the same, really. Different costumes, same poison. On the journey back, rain finally began to fall, beating against the windscreen like fingers tapping impatiently. Patrick drove in silence, his jaw tight, occasionally shaking his head as if trying to dislodge the memory of what had happened. In the back, Ian had fallen asleep against Cian's shoulder, his face peaceful in a way that made Moira's throat ache. How many more times would her children have to witness their mother being treated like something shameful? How many more doors would close in their faces? "It's not right," Patrick finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's not Christian. It's not—" "Moira, I'm sorry. I didn't know he'd—" "I should have." "You couldn't have known," Moira interrupted quietly. "Men like that hide their hatred well until they don't need to anymore, until they know you need something from them. That's when they show you who they really are." Patrick was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We'll find another place. We will. I promise you, Moira. I'll work double shifts. I'll take on extra jobs. Patrick." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "It's not about the money. It never was. There are some fights we can't win just by working harder." But even as she said it, another thought was forming, dark and certain. There were other kinds of fights, though. Fights that didn't depend on having money or property or the right bloodline. Fights that only required courage and truth and the willingness to burn everything down if necessary. The document hidden in her missile seemed to pulse with renewed urgency. She thought about Dr. Callum Byrne going about his life, probably attending dinner parties and medical conferences, shaking hands with important people. She thought about Seamus Byrne returning to his warm farmhouse, satisfied that he'd protected his precious reputation from contamination by traveler blood. And she thought about her 3 boys in the back of the van, damaged by one man's experiments and now rejected by another man's prejudice, inheriting a world that had hurt them before they even had a chance. Something inside Moira shifted, hardened, became sharp as glass. The shame she'd been carrying. Shame about the experiments, shame about keeping secrets, shame about her heritage, began to transform into something else entirely. Not shame, rage. And with the rage came clarity. She had been trying to protect everyone by staying silent, protecting Patrick's faith, protecting the boys from difficult truths, protecting herself from the consequences of speaking out. But silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only let the powerful remain powerful while the powerless absorbed blow after blow after blow. No more, Moira thought, watching the rain stream down the window. The words came to her with the force of a vow, a promise made to herself and to her sleeping sons and to her mother's memory. No more silence. No more shame. No more letting men like Byrne, either of them, win simply because that's how things had always been. The paper in her missile held names, dates, protocol numbers. It held proof. And proof, she was beginning to understand, was a kind of power all its own. Perhaps the only kind of power she had, but it might be enough. It would have to be enough, because the alternative, continuing to swallow indignities, continuing to watch her children diminished, continuing to carry secrets that poisoned everything they touched, that was no longer bearable. By the time they reached Salt Hill, the rain had become a downpour, the sea invisible behind sheets of gray water. But inside the van, inside Moira, something had changed. The humiliation at Seamus Byrne's doorstep would be the last time she bent her head and walked away. The next time someone tried to make her feel small, she would have weapons. She would have truth. And she would use it. Consequences be damned. It was nearly midnight when someone pounded on the door with such force that the entire frame shuddered. Moira jerked awake from uneasy sleep, her heart already racing before her mind had fully caught up. A woman's voice, young and trembling with panic, cut through the night. "For the love of God, help me, she's bleeding, please someone help!" Moira was on her feet before Patrick had even opened his eyes. She moved through the dark house by instinct, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door, her mind already cataloging what she might need. The old leather bag that had been her mother's sat on the shelf where it always did. She hadn't touched it in years, but muscle memory guided her hands to it now. Inside were the tools of a trade she'd half forgotten. Clean cloths, scissors, twine, herbs her mother had taught her to use for pain and bleeding. "Moira?" Patrick's voice came from the bedroom, confused and worried. "Someone needs help," she called back, already opening the door. "Stay with the boys." Outside, a battered car idled in the lane, its headlights cutting harsh beams through the mist. A young man stood by the driver's door, perhaps 20 years old, his face stark white with fear. "Please, Mrs. my sister. She's having the baby and something's wrong. There's blood everywhere and the hospital's too far and someone said you might know what to do." "Get in the car," Moira interrupted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She climbed into the back seat where a girl, barely more than a child herself, lay curled on her side, moaning. Blood had soaked through her nightdress and pooled on the seat beneath her. Moira's hands moved automatically, checking for a pulse, assessing the girl's color, calculating how much time they might have. "Drive," she commanded. "Drive fast, but steady. Where are we going?" "Connemara," the young man said, throwing the car into gear. "The big house, you know it? The Byrne place?" Moira's blood turned to ice. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she just heard. The universe couldn't be this cruel, could it? Couldn't be this perfectly, impossibly vindictive. But the girl in the back seat let out a cry of pain that cut through Moira's shock, and she pushed everything else aside. Whatever house this was, whatever name was attached to it, right now there was only a young woman bleeding and a baby trying to be born. The drive to Connemara felt endless. Moira worked in the cramped space of the back seat, doing what she could with what she had. She talked to the girl constantly, keeping her conscious, keeping her focused. "What's your name, love?" "Neve," the girl gasped between contractions. "Mrs. Byrne, I'm married to Thomas." Of course she was. Of course. Moira felt something twist in her chest. Rage and pity and a dark, bitter irony all mixed together. This was Seamus Byrne's daughter-in-law, the woman who would carry on the precious family line, and she was bleeding out in the back of a car, while Moira, the woman Seamus had deemed unfit to even purchase his land, was the only thing standing between her and death. "You're going to be fine, Neve," Moira said, and she meant it. Whatever she thought of the Byrne family, this girl had done nothing to her. This girl was just another woman caught in the machinery of men's choices and men's pride. "I've got you. Just hold on." When they finally arrived at the house, the same house where she'd been rejected just days before, Moira barely noticed the grandeur of it. She was carried forward by purpose and training, her mother's voice in her head guiding her hands. They brought Niamh to a bedroom on the ground floor, and Moira immediately began giving orders to the young brother, to the household staff who appeared in nightclothes, startled and frightened. Boil water, clean towels, all of them, and I need light. Proper light, not just candles. The birth was difficult. The baby was breech and Niamh had been bleeding too long. Moira worked with hands that remembered skills her conscious mind had half forgotten. Her mother's hands working through her, generations of women who had brought life into the world in kitchens and bedrooms and roadside camps, without hospitals or doctors or any of the things men called civilization. She talked to Niamh constantly, encouraging and commanding in equal measure, refusing to let the girl give up. And then, after what felt like hours, after Moira had begun to fear the worst, she felt the baby shift. Her hands guided the small body, turning it with infinite care, and then there was that moment, that impossible, miraculous moment, when the baby slipped free and took its first gasping breath. The cry that filled the room was thin and reedy, but absolutely alive, and Moira felt tears she hadn't known were there spill down her cheeks. She worked quickly, cutting the cord, clearing the baby's mouth and nose, wrapping the tiny girl in clean linens. Behind her, she heard Niamh sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Only when she was certain both mother and child were stable did Moira allow herself to pause, to notice the blood on her arms, the ache in her back from bending over the bed. That was when she became aware of the silence in the doorway. She turned and saw him standing there, Seamus Byrne. His face was ashen, his mouth open in shock. He looked from the newborn in Moira's arms to the exhausted but alive young woman in the bed, and then back to Moira herself. And in his eyes she saw the exact moment comprehension hit him. The realization of who had just saved his daughter-in-law's life, who had just delivered his first grandchild. The color drained from his face entirely. He seemed to age 10 years in that instant, all his earlier arrogance and certainty collapsing like wet paper. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely a whisper. You saved her. You saved them both." Moira looked at him for a long moment. She was exhausted, covered in another woman's blood, her body aching from the work of the past hours. But she felt strangely powerful, strangely clear. She walked toward him, still holding the newborn, and stopped directly in front of him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Life doesn't choose who deserves to live, Mr. Byrne, but God sees who chooses to help." She placed the baby carefully in a nearby cradle, then turned back to Seamus. His eyes were filled with tears now, his whole body trembling with the weight of what had just transpired. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Moira wasn't finished. "My mother delivered babies in ditches and fields. She saved lives that men like you thought were worthless. And I am my mother's daughter." She paused, letting the words settle. "You told me my blood wasn't good enough for your land, but it was good enough to save your bloodline tonight. Remember that." She gathered her mother's bag, now stained and heavy with the evidence of the night's work. As she moved toward the door, Seamus finally found his voice again, broken and desperate. "Wait, please. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Let me. How can I?" "You can start," Moira said without turning around, "by asking yourself what kind of man you've been, and what kind of man you want to die as. Because we all face judgment eventually, Mr. Byrne. All of us." She walked out of the room, out of the house into the gray dawn that was beginning to break over Connemara. Behind her, she heard voices rising, joy and relief, and the complex sounds of a family processing their near tragedy. But she didn't look back. She walked down the long drive, her mother's bag in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Not pride in having proven something to Seamus Byrne, though there was satisfaction in that, but pride in having honored her mother's legacy, in having used the gifts she'd been given to save lives regardless of whether those lives belonged to people who respected her. She had risen above the pettiness of revenge, above the temptation to let prejudice meet its natural consequences. She had chosen to be better than the hatred that had been directed at her. And yet, and this was the strange part, as she walked along the empty road waiting for someone to give her a lift back to Salt Hill, she realized that this encounter had changed something fundamental in her understanding of power. Seamus Byrne was a wealthy man, a landowner, someone with position and influence. But tonight, in the most important moment of his family's life, all of that had meant nothing. What had mattered was skill, courage, and the willingness to act. What had mattered was the knowledge passed down through generations of women who had survived precisely because they knew how to bring life into the world against all odds. She thought about the document hidden in her missile, about Dr. Byrne and his experiments, about all the power structures that seemed so immovable and absolute, and she thought, perhaps they're not as strong as they appear. Perhaps the powerful are only powerful until someone refuses to be powerless anymore. The sun rose fully as a lorry driver stopped to give her a lift. She climbed into the cab, exhausted but strangely energized, and as they drove back toward Salt Hill, she made a decision. She would wait. She would be patient, but she would also be ready. Because Seamus Byrne owed her a debt now, whether he fully understood it yet or not. And debts, she was learning, had a way of coming due at exactly the right moment. What he said the following morning would change everything. But for now, in the gray light of dawn, Moira allowed herself to simply sit with the knowledge that she had saved 2 lives, that she had honored her mother's memory, and that she had proven, at least to herself, that she was stronger than any man's contempt could make her believe otherwise. The following dawn seemed colder than usual in Connemara. The mist descended through the hills, and the Byrne house was wrapped in a dense silence, as if the very earth knew what had transpired within those walls. Moira had spent the night beside the young mother, caring for her and the newborn. When Niamh finally fell asleep, exhausted, Moira rose to leave. But as she descended the stairs, she found Seamus Byrne standing by the door, his face devastated, his eyes swollen with tears he'd been holding back. He no longer wore the same look of contempt from that afternoon days ago. He was bent over, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable as the man who had turned them away. "Moira, they told me it was you, that you saved my daughter-in-law's life. I don't know what to say." She remained silent, the scarf still stained with blood in her hands, her mother's leather bag heavy at her side. The weight of the night's work sat on her shoulders, but so did something else, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Just tell the truth, Mr. Byrne," she finally said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "And not to me, to God, because He's the one who'll judge what you've done." The words hit him like a physical blow. Seamus's face crumpled, and suddenly this man, this pillar of respectability and property, began to weep. Not the polite tears of a funeral or the controlled emotion of Sunday Mass, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. And then, to Moira's complete astonishment, he dropped to his knees right there in his own entrance hall, in front of the woman he had deemed unworthy to buy his land just days before. "Forgive me," he choked out, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. "For the love of God, forgive me. I sinned against you and against all your people. I've been a proud, hateful man, and tonight God showed me what my pride is worth. Nothing. It's worth nothing when it comes down to life and death." Moira looked down at this man on his knees, trembling before her. She felt no pleasure in it, no sense of vindication or victory. Instead, she felt only a profound weariness, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from carrying too much pain for too long. She had imagined this moment in different ways over the past days, imagined him humbled, imagined his acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but now that it was here, it felt hollow, insufficient, because what did his remorse change really? Her mother was still dead, having spent her life enduring slights from men just like him. Her children were still damaged by Dr. Byrne's experiments. Patrick's dream of the farm was still destroyed. One man's tears, one moment of recognition. What did that repair? And yet, there was something in his anguish that seemed genuine, something that spoke to a real reckoning happening inside him. Moira had seen false contrition before, the kind of apology that people offered when they were caught but didn't truly understand what they'd done wrong. This felt different. This felt like a man seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time in his life and being horrified by what he found. "Forgiveness is important, Seamus," she said quietly, using his Christian name for the first time, stripping away the formal distance of Mr. Byrne. "But repentance is what saves a soul. Do you understand the difference?" He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, and nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to." "Then stand up," Moira said, her voice gentler now but still firm. "A man doesn't grovel. He stands, faces what he's done, and does better. Can you do that?" Seamus rose unsteadily to his feet, using the doorframe for support. He seemed older somehow, as if the night had aged him years. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier but still heavy with emotion. "Tell me what I can do. Please. There must be something. I have money. I have influence. You have a chance," Moira interrupted. "That's what you have. A chance to be different than you were. Whether you take it or waste it, that's between you and God." She adjusted the bag on her shoulder, preparing to leave. The first light of dawn was creeping through the windows, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. Behind them, upstairs, she could hear the baby beginning to cry, that thin, insistent wail of new life demanding attention. It was a sound that had always moved her, even now, even after everything. Life continuing, despite all the ways humans tried to corrupt or diminish it. "The baby," Seamus said, following her gaze toward the stairs. "Neve wants to call her Iceling. It means dream, doesn't it? A vision?" He paused, his voice breaking again. "She told me. She wants to name her after hope. After the dream you gave back to us by saving her life." Moira felt something catch in her throat. "Iceling is a beautiful name," she managed. "May she grow up in a world kinder than the one we've made." As she moved toward the door, Seamus reached out, not to touch her, but as if to stop her with just the gesture. "Wait, please. I need to tell you something. About Dr. Byrne, about what he's been doing." Moira froze, her hand on the door handle. Slowly, she turned back to face him. "What about Dr. Byrne?" Seamus's expression shifted, guilt mixing with something that looked like determination. "I know him. We've worked together on certain projects. Medical research, he called it. I helped fund some of his work at the hospital." He took a shaky breath. "I didn't know at first. I swear to you, I didn't understand what he was really doing. But then I started hearing things. Women from poor families, traveler women, women who couldn't afford to question a doctor. Experimental treatments, things that weren't right." The world seemed to tilt beneath Moira's feet. She gripped the door handle harder, needing something solid to anchor herself. "You knew," she whispered, and the words came out like an accusation, like a curse. "You knew what he was doing, and you helped him." "Not knowingly," Seamus said quickly, desperately. "Not at first, but when I started to suspect, I looked the other way. I told myself it was for the advancement of medicine, that some good would come of it. I told myself the lies that men tell themselves when they want to avoid facing what they've become part of." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Moira, for all of it, for what I've enabled, for what I've been." Moira's mind was racing, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The document in her missile had mentioned Project Ariu, had mentioned experimental protocols, but she'd thought it was just Dr. Byrne, one rogue doctor conducting unauthorized research. She hadn't imagined there were others involved, men with money and influence who had made it all possible. Men like Seamus Byrne. "My children," she said, and her voice was shaking now, all the composure she'd maintained throughout the night finally cracking. "My 3 boys, were they part of his experiments?" Seamus's face went even paler. "I don't know. I never saw the patient lists, I provided funding. But Moira, if they were, if he did something to your family, then you need to know that there are records." He kept meticulous records of everything. In his office at the hospital, in his home. He documented every patient, every dosage, every outcome. Because he believed one day his research would be celebrated, that he'd be remembered as a pioneer. The rage that filled Moira then was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It was cold and pure and absolutely certain. "Where?" she demanded. "Where does he keep these records?" "His home office, I think, in Galway on Taylor's Hill." "But Moira, you can't just—" "Can't I?" She stepped closer to him, and he actually flinched. "You tell me that this man experimented on women and children, that he documented his crimes like they were achievements, and you think I can't do anything about it? You think I'll just walk away and let him continue?" "No," Seamus said, and now there was something like resolve in his voice. "No, I don't think that, and I don't want you to. That's why I'm telling you this. That's why I'll help you if you'll let me. I can't undo what I've been part of, but I can help bring it into the light." Moira studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or self-serving motivation. But all she saw was a man genuinely broken by his own conscience, a man who had been given a glimpse of what his complicity had cost and was horrified by it. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales. But it was something. It was a start. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But right now, I need to go home. I need to see my husband and my children. I need to—" She trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. What did she need? Answers. Justice. Revenge. Peace. All of it, and none of it. She left the house as the sun was fully rising, walking down the long drive with her mother's bag in her hand. Behind her she heard the sound of the baby crying again, Aisling's thin wail cutting through the morning air. A dream. That's what the name meant. But Moira was done with dreams. Dreams were for people who could afford to sleep peacefully at night. She needed something more concrete now. She needed truth. She needed proof. And now, thanks to Seamus Byrne's confession, she knew where to find it. The walk back to the main road took nearly an hour. She had plenty of time to think, to process, to plan. By the time a farmer stopped his lorry to offer her a lift back to Salt Hill, she had made her decision. She would use what Seamus had told her. She would find those records, and she would make sure that Dr. Callum Byrne faced the consequences of what he'd done. But she still didn't know that this encounter, this night of bringing life into the Byrne household, was only the beginning of the true reckoning. She didn't know that the connections between these men ran deeper than she'd imagined, that the web of complicity and cover-up stretched further than one doctor and one landowner. She didn't know that before this was over, she would have to make choices that would tear her own life apart as thoroughly as Dr. Byrne's experiments had damaged her children. All she knew, sitting in that lorry as it rattled back toward Salt Hill, was that the weight of forgiveness was proving to be just as heavy as the weight of secrets. Maybe heavier, because forgiving Seamus Byrne meant accepting that the world was more complicated than she wanted it to be, that people could be both cruel and capable of change, that justice wasn't always simple or clean or satisfying, but she would carry that weight, just as she'd carried everything else. Because that's what mothers did, what women did, what survivors did. They carried impossible burdens and kept walking forward anyway, step by painful step, toward something that might be healing, or might be only more pain. But at least it was movement. At least it was refusing to stay silent and still while the world ground them down into nothing. 2 weeks passed like years. Moira moved through her daily routines in a fog of exhaustion and anticipation, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name written in careful script on a plain envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a newspaper clipping, cut precisely from what looked like the Galway Advertiser. The headline made her stomach drop. Dr. Callum Byrne, champion of public health, launches parliamentary candidacy for Galway. The photograph below showed him in a crisp suit, shaking hands with dignitaries, that practiced smile of his suggesting both competence and compassion. And there, standing just behind him in the photo, hand on the doctor's shoulder in a gesture of support and endorsement, was Seamus Byrne. The room spun. Moira gripped the edge of the kitchen table, trying to breathe, trying to understand what she was seeing. The same man who had wept on his knees before her, who had promised to help expose Dr. Byrne's crimes, was publicly championing him for political office. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment she couldn't process it. Had everything been a lie? Had his tears, his remorse, his confession, had all of it been performance? She ran to the bedroom, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open the wardrobe. The hidden box came tumbling out, and she scattered its contents across the floor. Reports, prescriptions, official seals, receipts. Her fingers flew through the papers, looking for something, anything that would make sense of this. And then she found it. A financial document she'd seen before but never fully understood. A receipt for payment to Project Ariu dated from 5 years ago. At the bottom, a reference number, Protocol 4B, the same number from her own medical files. But now she noticed what she'd missed before. The letterhead. The payment hadn't come from the hospital. It had come from Byrne Investments, Connemara, a shell company, she realized now, her mind working with terrible clarity. A way to funnel money to Dr. Byrne's research without directly connecting it to Seamus's name. And below that, another document, a political donation form. Thousands of pounds given by concerned citizens for medical advancement to support Dr. Byrne's future political ambitions. The two Byrnes weren't just connected, they were partners. They had been from the beginning. And now, with Dr. Byrne running for office, Seamus wasn't just protecting his own reputation. He was investing in his collaborators' future, ensuring that the man who had conducted the experiments would have even more power, even more protection from scrutiny. Moira's vision blurred with rage and tears. She wanted to burn it all, to take these papers and set fire to everything that reminded her of what had been done to her family. Her hands actually reached for the matches on the bedside table, but then she stopped, because burning the evidence wouldn't hurt them. It would only protect them, destroy the only proof she had that any of this had happened. The sound of Patrick's footsteps on the stairs made her frantically gather the papers. She couldn't let him see. Not yet. Not like this. She shoved everything back into the box and pushed it under the bed just as he appeared in the doorway. "Moira, are you all right?" I heard. He stopped, taking in her tear-stained face, the way her hands were shaking. "What's happened? What's wrong?" She looked at her husband. Good, honest Patrick, who still believed the world made sense, who still thought that doctors healed and the powerful protected the weak. How could she tell him? How could she explain that their children's disabilities weren't God's will or genetic misfortune, but the deliberate result of medical experiments? That she'd known for weeks and said nothing? That the man who had humiliated them was the same man funding the doctor who had destroyed their sons' futures? "Nothing, Patrick," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Just old memories. Just ghosts." He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms with that gentle strength that had made her fall in love with him so many years ago. "You're not yourself lately, love. You haven't been since that night in Connemara. Whatever's troubling you, you can tell me. We're a team, aren't we? Whatever it is, we'll face it together." But they couldn't face this together, because Patrick's faith in the goodness of institutions and authority was part of who he was. If she told him what Dr. Byrne had done, it would destroy not just his trust in the medical system, but his entire understanding of how the world worked. It would poison his faith in God, because how could a loving God allow such things? And it would force him to see her differently too, as someone who had kept terrible secrets, who had known their children were victims, and said nothing. "I know we are," she managed, her voice muffled against his chest. "I'm just tired, that's all. Tired and worried about money and the boys and everything." He held her until her shaking subsided, then went back downstairs to make tea. The moment he was gone, Moira pulled the box out again and stared at the newspaper clipping. Dr. Byrne's face smiled up at her from the page, that politician's smile that promised integrity and service. The caption beneath the photo quoted him, "I've dedicated my career to improving health outcomes for all citizens, especially those in underserved communities. In Parliament, I'll fight to ensure every family has access to quality care." The hypocrisy was so staggering it took her breath away. He had built his career on the bodies of the underserved communities he now claimed to champion. He had experimented on poor women and traveler women and women like her who had no power to refuse him. And now he wanted to use that research that had destroyed lives, as his credential for political office. And Seamus Byrne was helping him do it. The man who had knelt before her and begged forgiveness was actively working to put Dr. Byrne in a position where he would be even more untouchable. Every word of remorse had been empty. Every tear had been performance. He had never intended to help her expose the truth. He had only wanted to ensure she would stay quiet, bought off by the emotional manipulation of a theatrical confession. That night, after Patrick had gone to sleep, Moira sat at the kitchen table with all the documents spread before her. She organized them methodically, creating a timeline, connecting the dots. Here was her first prescription for the vitamin supplements. Here was the protocol number that appeared on multiple receipts. Here was the payment from Byrne Investments. Here was the political donation. Every piece of paper was another link in a chain of complicity and cover-up. She worked until her eyes burned with exhaustion, until the candle had burned down to a stub. And when she was done, she had something that looked less like random scraps of evidence and more like a story. A damning, undeniable story of systematic abuse hidden behind medical authority and protected by money and influence. But who would believe her? She was still just a fisherman's wife, a woman with traveler blood, someone whose word would always be weighed against the testimonials of respected men. Even with this evidence, even with documents and receipts and protocols, they would find ways to discredit her. They would say she'd misunderstood, that she was confused, that her grief had made her paranoid and vindictive, unless she could find the other women, the other victims of Project Ariu. If she could locate even a few of them, if they could speak together, then it would be harder to dismiss them all as hysterical or lying. There was power in numbers, power in collective testimony. But how could she find them? She didn't know their names, didn't know where they lived. All she had were protocol numbers and dates. Unless someone with access to the hospital records could help her. Someone who might have their own reasons for wanting Dr. Byrne's crimes exposed. She thought of the nurse who had attended her during Cian's birth, the one who had whispered that cryptic warning about the body knowing things doctors shouldn't make it do. That woman had known something. Maybe she still worked at the hospital. Maybe she would remember. Maybe she would help. It was a thin hope, barely more than a thread, but it was something. And right now, something was all Moira had to hold on to. She gathered the papers carefully, returned them to the box, and hid it again. Then she went to bed, lying awake beside her sleeping husband, and made a plan. Tomorrow she would go to the hospital. She would find that nurse, or if not her, then someone else who had witnessed what Dr. Byrne had done. She would start building her case, piece by careful piece, until she had enough not just to accuse him but to prove it beyond any shadow of doubt. The revelation had been devastating. The betrayal had been complete. But from the ashes of her trust, something harder and more dangerous was being born. Not hope. Hope was too gentle a thing for what she felt now. This was determination. This was resolve. This was the absolute certainty that she would not be silenced, would not be bought off, would not let these men escape the consequences of what they had done. She thought of little Aisling, the baby she'd delivered in Seamus Byrne's house. That child was innocent of her grandfather's sins, innocent of the complex web of corruption she'd been born into. She deserved to grow up in a world where men like her grandfather and Dr. Byrne couldn't abuse their power with impunity. And Moira's own boys, Cian with his atrophied arm, Ian with his twisted foot, Oisin with his developmental delays, they deserved justice. They deserved to know that what had been done to them mattered, that their suffering hadn't been for nothing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, the sea crashed against the shore with that eternal rhythm that had always brought Moira comfort. The sea didn't judge or lie. It simply was, powerful and honest and utterly itself. She would try to be like that now. Not gentle, not forgiving, not understanding. Just true. Just relentless. Just determined to erode away the barriers that protected these men, until there was nothing left but the raw truth of what they'd done. And if that truth destroyed her in the process, if it cost her everything she had left, then so be it. Some things were worth more than personal peace. Some truths demanded to be spoken regardless of the cost. This was one of them, and she would speak it, or die trying. The parish hall in Galway was packed that winter afternoon. The air inside was thick with body heat and anticipation, windows fogged with condensation that obscured the gray sky beyond. Dr. Callum Byrne was scheduled to speak, a campaign event disguised as a community forum on healthcare access. Moira entered through the side door, her scarf pulled tight around her head, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Patrick had insisted they attend. "Maybe he can help us get that new prosthetic for Cian," he'd said that morning, his face bright with hope that made Moira want to weep. "He's running on healthcare reform, isn't he? Perhaps if we speak to him after, explain our situation." He had no idea. No idea that the man he wanted to ask for help was the architect of their children's suffering. No idea that Moira had been planning this moment for weeks, gathering courage like kindling for a fire she wasn't sure she could control once it started burning. They found seats near the middle of the hall. All around them, people chatted about the weather, the fishing season, the price of bread, normal concerns, normal lives. Moira felt like she was watching them from underwater, their voices muffled and distant. In her coat pocket, her fingers closed around the folded documents she'd brought. Not all of them. She wasn't that foolish, but enough to prove what she needed to prove if the moment came. When Dr. Byrne took the stage, the room fell quiet. He looked every inch the respectable candidate. Navy suit perfectly tailored, silver at his temples lending him gravitas. Glasses perched just so on his aristocratic nose. His smile was warm, practiced, utterly convincing. Moira felt bile rise in her throat. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "I'm here today because I believe healthcare is a right, not a privilege. Too many families in Galway and across Ireland are struggling to access basic medical care. Too many children aren't getting the treatment they need. He paused for effect, and Moira watched people around her nod in agreement. As your representative in Parliament, I will fight to ensure that every citizen, regardless of background, regardless of means, receives quality, ethical medical care. Ethical. The word hung in the air like poison. Moira's hands clenched into fists in her lap. Patrick squeezed her arm gently, mistaking her tension for engagement with the speech. She couldn't look at him. If she looked at him, she might break. Dr. Byrne continued, speaking of his years of dedication, his research into improving outcomes for disadvantaged populations, his vision for a healthcare system that served everyone equally. Every word was a knife. Every claim of compassion was an insult to her children, and all the others he had used as experimental subjects. The tension in Moira's chest built until she thought she might scream. Her vision narrowed to just Dr. Byrne on that stage, pontificating about ethics while photographs of his community work flashed on a screen behind him. She was preparing to stand, to speak, to throw her documents at his feet if necessary, when a voice cut through the room. "Dr. Byrne!" The shout came from the back of the hall, loud enough to silence the speaker and turn every head. "Before you speak any more about ethics, perhaps you should tell this community about Project Ariu." Moira's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. She twisted in her seat to see Seamus Byrne standing in the aisle, his face pale but determined, his hand raised as if to stop the proceedings by sheer force of will. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Dr. Byrne's face went rigid, his practiced smile freezing into something grotesque. "I'm sorry," he said, attempting to maintain his composure, "but this is not the appropriate forum for—" "Not appropriate?" Seamus's voice grew louder, stronger. He began walking down the aisle toward the stage, and people shifted in their seats to watch him. "Not appropriate to discuss how you experimented on vulnerable women? How you used poor families and travelers as test subjects without their informed consent? How you documented it all like they were laboratory animals rather than human beings?" The hall erupted. Voices overlapped in confusion and shock. Reporters at the front scrambled for their cameras and notepads. Dr. Byrne held up his hands, trying to regain control. "These are baseless accusations from a man who—" "Baseless?" Seamus reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. His hands shook, but his voice remained steady. "I have financial records showing my own complicity in funding your research. I have protocol numbers matching medical files of women who gave birth to damaged children. I have documentation of everything, Dr. Byrne. Everything you made me part of." Moira couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, voices rising in volume and pitch. Beside her, Patrick had gone completely still, his face draining of color as understanding began to dawn. She felt his gaze turn to her, questioning, but she couldn't look at him. Not yet. Not while this was happening. Dr. Byrne's composure finally cracked. "You have no right to—" "I have every right." Seamus's voice broke with emotion. "I helped you do this. I looked the other way because you convinced me it was for the greater good, that the ends justified the means. But there is no greater good that justifies what we did, what I helped you do." He turned to face the audience, his eyes searching until they found Moira. "There's a woman in this room whose 3 children bear the scars of your experimental protocols. A woman who saved my daughter-in-law's life despite the fact that I had treated her with contempt and prejudice. A woman who showed me more grace than I deserved, while I was helping the man who destroyed her family." Every eye in the hall turned toward Moira. She felt exposed, stripped bare, her secrets laid out for public consumption. Patrick's hand on her arm tightened, and when she finally forced herself to look at him, she saw confusion and hurt and dawning horror in his face. "Moira?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What is he talking about?" Before she could answer, reporters swarmed toward them, questions flying. Camera flashes made her flinch. She stood abruptly, needing air, needing space, needing to escape the suffocating attention. But Seamus's voice cut through the chaos once more. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, and the raw pain in his words silenced the room again. "I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for accountability, for investigation, for justice for all the families we hurt, including the O'Hanlons, including Moira Nichonile, who suffered in silence while we lived comfortably with our crimes." Dr. Byrne tried to leave the stage, but reporters blocked his path. shouting questions. Security guards materialized, trying to restore order. The hall descended into controlled chaos. People standing, arguing, demanding answers. Through it all, Moira stood frozen, Patrick beside her, both of them caught in the implosion of secrets that could no longer be contained. A reporter thrust a microphone toward her face. "Mrs. O'Hanlon, is it true? Were your children affected by these experiments?" Moira looked at the microphone, then at Dr. Byrne, struggling to maintain dignity as his career collapsed around him, then at Seamus Byrne, who stood with tears streaming down his face, having destroyed himself to reveal the truth. Finally, she looked at Patrick, whose eyes begged her for explanation, for denial, for anything that would make this nightmare make sense. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected, clear enough to cut through the noise. "My 3 sons. Protocol 4B. I have the documents. I've had them for months." She pulled the papers from her pocket, held them up for everyone to see. "Dr. Byrne gave me experimental drugs during my pregnancies, told me they were vitamins. My children are disabled because of what he did to them before they were even born." The admission seemed to suck all the air from the room. In the terrible silence that followed, she heard Patrick make a sound like he'd been struck. She turned to him, saw tears beginning to stream down his face. "You knew?" His voice broke on the words. "You knew what caused it? And you never told me?" "Patrick." She reached for him, but he pulled away, stumbling back from her like she was a stranger, like the woman he'd loved for 20 years had become someone he didn't recognize. "How long?" he demanded. "How long have you known?" "Since the night at Connemara," she whispered. "Since I delivered Seamus's granddaughter. That's when I found the first documents, and then he told me more. And you lied to me." Patrick's face twisted with anguish. "For weeks you lied to me. You let me believe it was God's will, let me pray for acceptance, let me dream of farms and fresh starts when you knew." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the magnitude of the betrayal. "I was trying to protect you," Moira said, her own tears flowing now. "I didn't know what to do, how to tell you Protect me?" Patrick laughed bitterly. "Or protect yourself from having to face what you'd done." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "What I'd done? Patrick, I'm not the one who— You took those pills, didn't you? You're the one who swallowed them. And then you kept the secret. Let me go on thinking our boys were just born unfortunate when all this time you knew someone had done this to them. To us." His voice rose with each word, pain and rage mixing into something she'd never heard from him before. "We could have fought this, we could have done something. But you chose silence. You chose to let him walk free, while you carried your guilt like it was some kind of martyrdom." The truth of his words cut deeper than any lie could have, because he was right. She had carried the secret like it was her burden alone, had wrapped herself in the suffering of it, had made it about her guilt and her pain rather than fighting for her children's justice. She had been so focused on protecting Patrick's faith, on maintaining some illusion of normalcy, that she had let Dr. Byrne continue his career unchallenged for months. Around them, the chaos continued. Security was escorting Dr. Byrne out through a side door, reporters chasing after him. Other journalists were interviewing Seamus, recording his confession for tomorrow's headlines. People were arguing, crying, demanding explanations. But in the center of it all, Moira and Patrick stood in their own bubble of devastation, their marriage cracking open along fault lines that had been hidden beneath years of assumed understanding. "I'm sorry," Moira whispered. "Patrick, I'm so sorry. I should have told you immediately, You should have trusted me," Patrick said, and the quiet devastation in his voice was worse than his anger had been. "You should have trusted that we could face this together. But you didn't. You never do. You carry everything alone, like you're the only one strong enough, like I'm just some simple fisherman who needs protecting from difficult truths." He shook his head, backing toward the door. I can't be here right now. I can't look at you. Patrick, please." But he was already leaving, pushing through the crowd, disappearing into the gray afternoon. Moira stood alone in the middle of the parish hall, surrounded by strangers and cameras and the ruins of everything she'd been trying to protect. Days passed, then weeks. The newspapers ran the story for a while. Medical scandal rocks Galway. Doctors' dark experiments exposed. Political hopeful's career in ruins. But as these things always do, the story faded. Dr. Byrne's name disappeared from the headlines. Legal proceedings began, then stalled, then quietly dissolved into settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Families were paid to forget, records were sealed, and the machinery of institutional protection ground on, smoothing over the scandal until it became just another regrettable incident, spoken of in hushed tones, and then not at all. Winter deepened. The following February brought storms that battered the coast with particular fury, as if the sea itself was angry. Patrick went out fishing in weather he shouldn't have, taking risks that made the other fishermen shake their heads and mutter about grief making men reckless. He barely spoke to Moira anymore. When he came home, he would sit by the fire with the boys, gentle with them as always, but there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The easy intimacy of their marriage had died in that parish hall, killed by secrets and lies and truths revealed too late. On a bitter morning in late February, Patrick didn't come home. The harbor master found him at dawn, collapsed on the dock beside his boat, tools still in his hands. A massive heart attack, the doctor said. Probably instantaneous. He wouldn't have suffered. Moira stood beside the body in the morgue, looking down at his face, peaceful now in a way it hadn't been for months. His hands were still stained with grease from the boat repairs he'd been doing when his heart gave out. Working hands, honest hands, hands that had held their children with such tenderness, that had touched her with such love, that had pulled away from her that terrible afternoon when he learned she'd been lying to him for months. No tears came, just a vast, terrible emptiness, as if someone had hollowed her out and left nothing but a shell. She thought she should feel something. Grief, guilt, regret, anything. But there was only this cold void where her heart used to be, this sense that time had finally stopped and she was suspended in amber, unable to move forward or back. The funeral was well attended. The fishing community came out in force, weathered men in dark suits speaking in low voices about what a good man Patrick had been, how hard he'd worked, how much he'd loved his family. Women from the parish brought casseroles and kind words. Everyone seemed to know what to say except Moira, who stood beside the grave in her black dress and felt like she was watching someone else's life, someone else's tragedy. Ian cried throughout the service, his small body shaking with sobs he didn't fully understand. Eowyn stood silent and solemn, his twisted foot planted firmly on the ground, his jaw set with determination not to break down. Oisin hummed to himself, that tuneless sound he made when the world became too much, and Moira held his hand and let him hum, because what else was there to do? Seamus Byrne came to the funeral. He stood at the back, respectful distance maintained, and didn't approach her. But she saw him there, saw the guilt written across his face, and wondered if he understood that his confession, while necessary, while right, had cost her more than just secrets. It had cost her the man she loved, the marriage she'd built, the one person who had been her anchor through every storm. Months passed. Moira learned to navigate widowhood with the same grim determination she'd brought to everything else. She took in mending, did cleaning work for wealthier families, stretched every penny until it screamed. The boys grew despite everything. Ian learned to write with his good hand, developed a beautiful, careful script that made his teachers praise him. Ian found he had a gift for music, could coax heartbreaking melodies from an old tin whistle. Oisin's development remained slow, but he was kind, unfailingly kind, with a smile that could light up the darkest room. They survived. That was what Moira told herself on the hard days. They survived. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, wasn't the future Patrick had dreamed of, but they were still here, still moving forward. That had to count for something. Then, on an autumn afternoon when the light slanted gold across the water, Seamus Byrne appeared at her door. He looked older than when she'd last seen him, more stooped. Gray hair turned white, but his eyes were clear. In his arms he carried a child, a little girl with dark curls and bright eyes who couldn't have been more than 18 months old. "Moira," he said quietly, "may I speak with you?" She almost closed the door in his face, but something in his expression stopped her. Not guilt this time, but a kind of peace she hadn't seen before. She stepped aside and let him enter. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd spread out all those damning documents so many months ago. The baby, Aisling, she realized, the child she'd delivered, played contentedly on the floor with a rag doll. "She's beautiful," Moira said, because it was true, and because she didn't know what else to say. "She is," Seamus agreed, "perfect and healthy, because of you." He paused, watching the child with evident love. "Niamh wants you to know she's named her godchild after hope, after what you gave back to us. I didn't give you hope. Moira said flatly. I delivered a baby. That's all. No. Seamus shook his head. You gave me back my conscience, my soul. You made me see what I'd become. From his coat he pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table between them. I've set up a trust for families affected by Project Ariu. Anonymous donations administered through the church, so there's no stigma, no questions. It won't undo the damage, but it will provide care, equipment, therapy, whatever's needed. Moira stared at the envelope. Money doesn't fix everything. No, Seamus agreed. But it helps. And it's all I have to offer. That and my testimony. The legal cases may have been buried, but I've made sure the story is documented. Properly, completely, so it can never be completely erased. He stood, preparing to leave, but paused at the door. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but if God can forgive me someday, I hope it will be because of women like you, who showed me what real courage looks like. Before Seamus left, he knelt one final time, not in supplication but in genuine respect and sorrow. Your husband was a good man. The world is poorer without him, and I'm sorry, sorrier than words can express, for my part in the pain you've carried. After he left, Moira sat at the table for a long time, looking at the envelope. Inside was paperwork for the trust, contact information, resources, practical help. Not justice, not restoration, not Patrick brought back from the grave or her children made whole, but something, a recognition that what had been done mattered, that their suffering hadn't been for nothing. That evening, she walked down to the shore with the boys. They threw stones into the waves, competed to see whose would go furthest. Cian managed a surprising distance with his good arm, and Ewan's competitive streak made him keep trying despite his limp. Hoisin just laughed, delighted by the splash each stone made, caring nothing for the competition. Moira watched them and felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. A crack in the ice that had formed around her heart, letting in a thin stream of warmth. They had lost so much. Patrick's absence was a wound that would never fully close. The damage to her children's bodies couldn't be undone. The months of secrets and lies had poisoned what might have been. But they were still here, still alive, still capable of throwing stones and laughing and finding moments of joy despite everything the world had thrown at them. That was its own kind of victory, wasn't it? Not the dramatic triumph she'd imagined when she first discovered those documents, but something quieter and perhaps more real. She thought about all the choices she'd made, taking those pills, keeping the secret, exposing the truth too late to save her marriage. Were they the right choices? She didn't know. She would never know. But they were the choices she'd made with the knowledge and courage she'd had at the time, and she was still here, still fighting, still trying to build something good from the wreckage. As the sun set over Galway Bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Moira turned to her sons. Time to head home, loves. Ma'am? Cian looked up at her, his green eyes so like her own. Are we going to be all right? She crouched down to his level, cupped his face in her hands. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to try. Every day we're going to get up and try, and maybe that's enough. Walking back to their small house, boys chattering around her, Moira thought about everything she'd learned, about how love doesn't cure all bodies, but can heal the shame others try to plant in you, about how silence can be as destructive as any lie, about how justice is messy and incomplete and rarely looks like what you imagined, about how survival is its own kind of courage, and sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply refusing to let the cruelty of others define who you become. She thought about Patrick, hoped he was at peace, hoped he understood why she'd made the choices she did even if he'd never been able to forgive them. She thought about her mother, wondered if she'd be proud of the fight her daughter had waged, even with all its costs and compromises. She thought about all the other women out there, carrying their own secrets, fighting their own battles, surviving in the face of systems designed to crush them. And for the first time in months, she smiled. A small smile, tired and sad but real, because she was still here. They were still here. And tomorrow they would wake up and face another day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Not because they'd won some grand victory, but because that's what survivors do. They survive. They carry on. They find reasons to smile despite everything. The house was cold when they arrived home, but Moira built up the fire until it crackled warmly. She made tea and toast for the boys, supervised their washing up, tucked them into bed with the prayers her own mother had taught her. And then, finally alone, she stood at the window looking out at the dark sea. How many truths had she buried inside herself to protect those she loved? Too many. And had the silence weighed more than the sins themselves? In the end, yes. The silence had been its own kind of death, slowly suffocating everything good until the truth finally burst forth and destroyed what it was meant to protect. But she'd spoken. Eventually. Imperfectly. Too late to save some things, but in time to prevent more harm. And maybe that was all any of us could do. Muddle through with imperfect courage, making flawed choices with incomplete information, and hoping that somehow, despite everything, we'd done more good than harm. She thought about the question Seamus had raised about God's forgiveness, about redemption. She didn't have answers, but she knew this. Forgiveness wasn't something you received. It was something you practiced. Toward others, toward yourself, toward a world that would never be as just or as kind as you wanted it to be. You kept practicing it, kept choosing it, even when, especially when, it felt impossible. Would she have done things differently? If she could go back? The question was meaningless. She couldn't go back. None of them could. All anyone could do was move forward, carrying their scars and their lessons, trying to be a little braver, a little more honest, a little more forgiving with each passing day. As she finally turned away from the window and prepared for bed, Moira whispered a prayer, not to ask for anything, but simply to acknowledge that she was still here, still trying, still hoping that somehow, someday, all of this would make sense, that the suffering would be redeemed, that the losses would be given meaning, that the courage it took to simply survive would be recognized as the miracle it truly was. And in the silence that followed her prayer, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not peace exactly, but the possibility of it, the promise that perhaps, eventually, the weight she'd been carrying might become bearable, that perhaps survival could transform into something more like living, that perhaps, against all odds and expectations, there might still be room in her damaged heart for joy. Outside, the sea continued its eternal rhythm, waves breaking against the shore, constant and unchanging. Inside, 3 boys slept peacefully, their dreams innocent of the battles that had been fought on their behalf. And Moira Neach O'Neill, widow and mother and survivor, closed her eyes and let herself imagine a future where the past no longer had quite so much power to hurt them. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when this all began, but it was an ending nonetheless. And perhaps if she was very lucky and very brave, it might also be a beginning.